This channel is for women who are doing fine, but feel quietly lost. There is a kind of woman the world almost never notices correctly. Not because she is invisible. Not because she is plain. Not because she lacks presence. But because what makes her unforgettable does not behave like ordinary beauty, or ordinary power, or anything the culture knows how to measure. She does not always enter a room like a storm. She does not need to speak first. She does not need to prove she is intelligent, desirable, resilient, or in control. And yet something happens when she appears. The air changes. People straighten without knowing why. A conversation that felt loud a moment ago begins to feel strangely shallow. Even silence seems to gather around her differently. And the unsettling part is this. Most people cannot explain what they are reacting to. Because her power is not performance. It is not the polished confidence the world teaches women to imitate. It is not the confidence of a perfect outfit, a brilliant smile, a successful career, a toned body, or a life arranged so beautifully that no one thinks to ask whether she is lonely. It is something quieter. Something older. Something far more dangerous to the world of appearances. It is the power of a woman who no longer needs to abandon herself to belong. That is the mystery. And once I began to see it, I could not unsee it. I started noticing that the women who stayed in my mind were rarely the loudest ones. They were not always the youngest, the trendiest, the most glamorous, or the most socially gifted. Sometimes they were women in their 40s, 50s, 60s. Women with softness in their face and steadiness in their eyes. Women who looked like they had suffered enough to become real. Women whose presence carried no desperation. No silent begging to be approved of. No restless need to be chosen. Just a kind of calm authority that made everything artificial around them feel thin. And I realized something that unsettled me to my core. Most women are taught to chase confidence without ever being told what it actually is. We are taught how to appear composed, how to be likable, how to be impressive, how to be competent, productive, self-aware, emotionally intelligent, desirable, independent, adaptable, and endlessly strong. We are taught how to survive being watched. We are taught how to smile through exhaustion. We are taught how to stay useful, how to stay attractive, how to stay fine. But almost no one teaches a woman how to stay connected to herself. So she learns something else instead. She learns how to disappear in ways that look beautiful from the outside. She becomes the reliable one. The capable one. The woman who can handle it. The woman who remembers everything, holds everything, softens everything, absorbs everything. She becomes the woman people admire because she is so strong, while quietly forgetting that strength is not the same thing as self-possession. And one day, usually much later, she feels it. Not as a breakdown. Not as a dramatic collapse. Not as a visible crisis anyone else would rush to name. She feels it as a strange emptiness in the middle of an ordinary day. Maybe while unloading groceries. Maybe while sitting in a meeting. Maybe while standing at the sink with warm water running over her hands. Maybe while driving home in evening traffic, staring at the red blur of taillights, with a life that looks stable from the outside and feels curiously uninhabited from within. She realizes she has been living, but not fully arriving. She has been speaking, but not saying what matters. She has been needed, but not deeply met. She has been functioning so well that no one noticed she was slowly becoming absent from her own life. And that absence has a very particular pain. It is not the pain of obvious tragedy. It is the pain of quiet self-loss. The pain of being a woman who is not falling apart, but is no longer fully alive. That is why this conversation matters. Because I do not think women like this are looking for motivation. I do not think they need louder advice, brighter slogans, or another list of habits to become more optimized versions of themselves. I think many of them are simply starving for one honest sentence. A sentence that names what they have been carrying in silence. A sentence that says, your exhaustion may not be laziness. Your numbness may not be peace. Your independence may not be freedom. Your composure may not be confidence. And the life-changing question is not, how do I become more impressive? It is, at what point did I start leaving myself behind? That question opens a door most people spend years avoiding. Because real confidence does not begin when I become better at being seen. It begins when I become unwilling to keep betraying what I know, what I feel, what my body has been trying to tell me, what my soul has been whispering underneath the noise. There is something almost frightening about a woman who has reached that threshold. Not because she becomes cold. Not because she becomes unreachable. Not because she stops caring. But because she becomes harder to control. The world knows what to do with a woman who is still performing for love. It knows what to do with a woman who needs approval to feel safe. It knows what to do with a woman who is always trying to earn her place. But a woman who has begun returning to herself. A woman who has become intimate with her own inner life. A woman who no longer confuses being wanted with being valued. A woman who can sit alone in the silence and not immediately run from what she feels. That woman carries a kind of presence the world cannot easily manipulate. And people feel it before they understand it. That is why some women seem magnetic without trying. That is why their silence has weight. That is why they do not need to chase attention for the room to bend around their presence. Something inside them has come back into alignment. Mind, body, soul. Not perfect. Not untouched. Not fearless. But real. And maybe that is what makes them unforgettable. They are no longer divided against themselves. So in this video, I want to take you into that mystery. I want to talk about the secret truly confident women know, the secret that has nothing to do with perfection and everything to do with self-trust. I want to explore why some women, without announcing anything, radiate a quiet force that cannot be faked. And I want to go beneath the surface of performance, beneath polished femininity, beneath the exhausting pressure to always seem okay, and ask a deeper question. What changes in a woman when she finally stops abandoning herself? If this kind of conversation speaks to something private in you, subscribe to the channel and support this space. It helps keep these videos alive, and it tells me that this quieter, deeper kind of truth still matters. Because what comes next may explain a feeling you have carried for years but never had the words to name. And once you see it, you may never look at confidence the same way again. What I was taught to call confidence had very little to do with peace. It had everything to do with appearance, control, and the ability to remain convincing under pressure. Confidence, I learned, was supposed to look polished. It was supposed to sound clear, move quickly, and never hesitate too long. It was supposed to know how to enter a room, how to hold eye contact, how to answer without trembling, how to recover without showing the wound. It was supposed to be attractive but not vain, capable but not intimidating, warm but not needy, strong but never messy. The version of confidence I absorbed was not really about being rooted in myself. It was about being legible to other people in the right way. And that difference matters more than most women realize. Because a woman can become very skilled at looking secure while feeling inwardly split. She can learn how to speak with authority and still go home replaying her own voice in her head. She can build a life that appears stable, elegant, even admirable, and still feel like she is standing just outside of it, performing the role of someone who belongs there. She can be praised for her calm, her competence, her emotional maturity, while privately living with a nervous system that never fully unclenches. That is one of the quiet tragedies of adult womanhood. So much of what is rewarded in women has the shape of confidence, but not the substance. I think many women first discover this in work. Not because work is the whole story, but because work teaches us very quickly which parts of ourselves are considered useful. I can be prepared, articulate, responsive, and impressively composed. I can know how to present an idea, how to smooth a difficult conversation, how to seem unfazed. And yet none of that necessarily means I trust myself. Sometimes it only means I have become highly adapted. Adaptation is not the same as confidence. Adaptation says, learn the room, manage the room, survive the room. Confidence says, remain connected to myself inside the room. Those are not equal achievements. For years, I did not know the difference. I thought the tightness in my body was ambition. I thought emotional restraint was maturity. I thought being the one who could handle everything meant I was strong. But there is a strain that lives inside this kind of strength. A woman can spend decades becoming excellent at self-management while never asking whether she feels safe, honest, or truly present inside her own life. That question is inconvenient, which is partly why so many women avoid it. If I ask whether I look confident, I can answer with evidence. I can point to my work, my tone, my discipline, my ability to show up. If I ask whether I feel at home in myself, the answer gets quieter and harder to control. It asks different things of me. It asks whether I can rest without guilt, whether I can disappoint someone without collapsing into shame, whether I know how to stop speaking when I start leaving myself in the sentence, whether my private life feels like a place where I live, or only a place where I recover enough to perform again. That is why so many common definitions of confidence are false. They describe a woman's presentation, not her relationship with herself. And presentation can be learned for all kinds of reasons that have nothing to do with inner steadiness. A woman may become polished because she grew up in a home where mistakes were costly. She may become charming because warmth was the safest form of self-protection. She may become hypercompetent because being needed felt more secure than being known. She may become emotionally controlled because she learned early that visible distress made other people uncomfortable. She may become fiercely independent because relying on others once hurt too much. From the outside, all of this can look like confidence. But often it is biography. It is adaptation shaped into a personality others admire. There is tenderness in realizing this. Because it means many women are not failing at confidence. They have simply been measuring it by the wrong standard. Real confidence is not how little I need. It is not how perfectly I hold myself together. It is not how effectively I hide confusion, longing, grief, or uncertainty. It is not the ability to move through life untouched. In fact, one of the strongest women I know how to be is a woman who allows life to touch her and still does not disappear. That kind of confidence is almost never loud. It does not rush to prove itself. It does not need every silence filled. It does not panic when approval is delayed. It does not perform certainty to avoid looking human. It can say, I need time. It can say, that did not sit right with me. It can say, I do not know yet. It can say nothing at all and still remain internally anchored. The world does not always celebrate this immediately, because the world is more comfortable with women who are readable. Readable women are easier to place, easier to praise, easier to use, easier to predict. But a woman who begins living from inner steadiness becomes less available for those old arrangements. She does not over-explain as quickly. She does not volunteer all her softness into spaces that have not earned it. She does not mistake being chosen for being cherished. She does not offer endless access just to prove she is good. This can look like distance to people who benefited from her over-availability. But it is not distance. It is alignment. There is also a false idea that confidence means certainty. I do not believe that anymore. Some of the least confident periods of my life were the ones in which I tried hardest to appear certain. Certainty can become a costume. It can become a way of outrunning vulnerability. It can make a woman rigid, brittle, and deeply alone. Confidence, by contrast, can coexist with ambiguity. I can be uncertain and still self-trusting. I can be grieving and still grounded. I can be in transition and still deeply rooted. I can change my mind and still respect myself. This matters, especially in the middle chapters of life, when many women begin to outgrow identities that once seemed permanent. The self that got me through my 20s or 30s may not be the self that can carry me honestly now. And when that old structure starts to crack, I may mistake the discomfort for failure. But often it is a correction. A deeper intelligence is trying to separate performance from truth. The woman I become next will not be built from image. She will be built from congruence. That word matters to me. Congruence. The feeling that my outer life is no longer in constant violation of my inner one. The feeling that my words, my choices, my body, my values, and my silence are beginning to belong to the same woman. This is the kind of confidence most people cannot teach, because it is not learned through slogans. It is learned through contact, through honesty, through noticing where I become false in order to remain acceptable. Once I began to understand this, I stopped admiring women only for how impressive they seemed. I became more interested in something quieter. Did they seem internally rushed or inwardly settled? Did their warmth feel expensive, as if it cost them something? Did their strength feel hard, or did it feel inhabited? Were they performing calm, or were they actually at ease? These are different energies. My body knows the difference even when language arrives later. And perhaps that is the real turning point in a woman's life. Not when she becomes more impressive, but when she becomes unwilling to confuse performance with power. Because the confidence I was taught to chase could be copied. The confidence I am learning to trust has to be lived. And it begins the moment I stop asking how to look secure, and start asking whether I am willing to believe myself when something inside me says, this is not who I am anymore. There is a moment in a woman's life that almost no one sees, but everything begins to change there. It is not the moment she becomes louder. Not the moment she becomes more admired. Not the moment she finally finds the perfect words, the perfect boundary, the perfect plan, or the perfect version of herself. It is something much quieter, and far more difficult than any visible transformation. It is the moment I begin to believe myself. That may sound simple until I understand how rarely many women actually do it. I do not mean believing in myself in the polished, public sense. I do not mean confidence as a slogan. I do not mean looking in the mirror and repeating something beautiful enough to survive the day. I mean something far more intimate, far more private. I mean believing that what I feel is real before anyone agrees with me. Believing that what I sense deserves my attention before it becomes obvious enough to justify. Believing that the ache in my chest, the hesitation in my body, the exhaustion in my bones, the resistance I keep talking myself out of, the sadness I keep renaming, the quiet longing I keep pushing aside, all of it means something. This is the real root of self-trust. And for many women, it is where life has been quietly broken for years. Because a woman can be highly intelligent and still not believe herself. She can be sensitive, perceptive, accomplished, deeply capable, and still distrust her own inner reality. She can notice something is wrong and immediately explain it away. She can feel hurt and call herself dramatic. She can sense misalignment and tell herself she is overthinking. She can feel her body contract in a room, in a conversation, in a relationship, in a commitment, and still keep moving forward because she has been trained to treat her own signals as less important than keeping the peace. That is not a small thing. That is how a woman becomes estranged from herself while appearing completely functional. I think this estrangement often begins long before she has language for it. It begins in those early moments when something inside her reacts honestly, and that honesty is not welcomed. She senses tension and is told everything is fine. She feels uncomfortable and is told she is too sensitive. She speaks a need and watches someone become irritated, disappointed, or withdrawn. She notices that truth creates friction, while adaptation creates approval. And because she is intelligent, she learns quickly. She learns how to rearrange herself before anyone has to ask. Years later, this may look like maturity, but often it is an old survival habit, refined until it resembles character. So when I say the first secret is that I believe myself, I am speaking about a return that is much deeper than opinion. I am speaking about the restoration of inner authority. Not arrogance. Not impulsiveness. Not treating every emotion as final truth. Inner authority is quieter than that. It is the willingness to stay close to my own experience long enough to hear what it is trying to tell me. It is the refusal to make other people my first mirror. It is the decision to stop living as though my body, my intuition, my grief, my joy, my unease, my desire, all need outside permission before they can count as real. This is where self-trust begins to breathe again. I have come to believe that women lose themselves less through one great betrayal and more through 1,000 tiny abandonments. Small moments. Easy to dismiss. Easy to normalize. I say yes because saying no feels selfish. I laugh because telling the truth would make the room uncomfortable. I stay a little longer in what drains me because leaving would force a confrontation I do not feel ready to have. I tell myself I am just tired when what I really am is heartsick. I call it stress when it is sorrow. I call it patience when it is fear. I call it love when it is over-accommodation. I call it maturity when I am disappearing. This is how self-trust erodes. Not dramatically. Repetitively. Every time I override my own knowing, something in me notices. Every time I betray an inner signal to preserve an outer arrangement, something in me records it. The body records it. The nervous system records it. The psyche learns from it. And slowly, without ever saying the words aloud, I begin to teach myself a devastating lesson: my truth is negotiable. Once that lesson settles in, life becomes noisy. I ask too many people what they think. I search for reassurance in places that cannot give it. I second-guess clean instincts. I stay in confusion longer than necessary because confusion feels more familiar than self-trust. I become vulnerable to anyone who sounds certain, anyone who names my life more boldly than I do, anyone who offers me a script strong enough to drown out my own inner voice. This is why the ability to believe myself is not a soft skill. It is a form of psychological protection. A woman who does not believe herself can be guided anywhere. A woman who does begins to become harder to distort. That does not mean life becomes easy. In some ways, it becomes more demanding. Because once I begin to believe myself, I can no longer pretend not to know what I know. I can no longer hide so comfortably inside confusion. I can no longer call every form of self-betrayal kindness. I can no longer go numb as easily. Believing myself makes me more honest, and honesty is not always immediately soothing. Sometimes it breaks the arrangement that was keeping my life outwardly tidy. But it also breaks the spell. It breaks the spell that says my discomfort is meaningless unless it becomes dramatic. It breaks the spell that says intuition is unreliable unless it can be proven in advance. It breaks the spell that says my needs are less valid because other people have bigger ones. It breaks the spell that says my exhaustion is a moral failure instead of a message. It breaks the spell that says I must remain endlessly understandable in order to be worthy of love. When I begin to believe myself, even gently, I notice what I have been editing out of my own life. I notice which conversations leave me unsettled for hours. I notice where my body tightens before my mind catches up. I notice how often I apologize when I have done nothing wrong. I notice the grief under the efficiency. I notice the loneliness hidden inside being admired. I notice the ways I have been asking for advice when what I really want is permission to honor what I already know. This is why self-trust feels sacred. It is not just self-esteem with better language. It is the slow rebuilding of the relationship I have with my own interior life. And like any relationship, it deepens through respect. I respect my sadness enough to ask what it is carrying. I respect my anger enough to wonder what boundary it is pointing toward. I respect my joy enough not to dismiss it as impractical. I respect my fatigue enough to stop treating myself like a machine with manners. I respect my intuition enough to pause when something inside me says, "Pay attention." This kind of believing changes a woman from the inside out. She does not become reckless. She becomes coherent. Her decisions may still be difficult, but they stop feeling borrowed. Her life may still contain uncertainty, but it no longer feels entirely outsourced. She begins to stand in her own experience with a steadier spine. And maybe that is the first true secret confident women know. Not that they never doubt. Not that they are always sure. Not that they have mastered life. But that when something deep inside them speaks, they no longer rush to silence it. They listen. They stay. They believe themselves. And once a woman begins to do that, another truth starts rising almost immediately beneath it. I cannot keep living the same way if I want to remain close to who I am. A woman rarely loses herself in one dramatic moment. It would almost be easier if she did. If there were one betrayal, one unmistakable ending, one visible fracture, then at least the pain would have a name. At least she could point to the wreckage and say, "That is where I disappeared." But that is not usually how it happens. More often, the loss is quiet, repetitive, socially acceptable. It happens in ways the world rewards, or at least does not question. It happens while I am still showing up, still functioning, still answering messages, still doing what needs to be done. From the outside, I may even look admirable. That is what makes it so difficult to detect. Silent self-abandonment does not always look like collapse. Sometimes it looks like competence. Sometimes it looks like being the dependable one, the reasonable one, the woman who can absorb disappointment without making anyone else uncomfortable. Sometimes it looks like the life I built because it made sense on paper, because it kept things stable, because it asked me to be good at surviving rather than honest about what I felt. The danger is not only that I become exhausted. The deeper danger is that I become unfamiliar to myself and still call it adulthood. This process often begins long before a woman has words for it. It begins in the small emotional economies of early life. In homes where moods had to be monitored. In families where love was present but unpredictably expressed. In environments where a girl learned that emotional truth could disturb the system, while adaptation kept the system intact. She may become the peacemaker, the helper, the achiever, the daughter who needs little and gives much. She learns to sense what the room requires and move toward it quickly. She becomes perceptive in a way people praise. Mature for her age. Easy to rely on. But beneath that praise, something else may be taking shape. She is learning that belonging is safest when I do not trouble anyone too much with the full weight of myself. That lesson does not vanish when she becomes a woman. It becomes more sophisticated. Now it may appear in marriage, where she becomes the emotional translator of the household, the one who notices the tension before it becomes a conflict, the one who smooths, anticipates, remembers, and absorbs. It may appear in motherhood, where love is real but the role is so consuming that her own interior life begins to feel like a luxury she no longer has the right to prioritize. It may appear at work, where she becomes known for being composed, responsive, and endlessly capable, and slowly starts confusing self-erasure with professionalism. It may appear after divorce, when survival demands so much strength that she begins to live in a state of permanent internal bracing. It may appear in singleness too, where independence becomes so practiced that tenderness starts to feel like exposure rather than home. In all of these forms, the pattern is similar. I stop asking what I feel, and start asking what is needed. At first, this can look noble, responsible, mature, and in some seasons, it may be necessary. There are years in a woman's life when duty is real, when there is no elegant escape from what must be carried. I do not say this lightly. Many women have held families together, kept households running, rebuilt lives from financial and emotional wreckage, cared for children, cared for parents, worked full days, then come home and worked again in quieter ways no one counted. There is dignity in that endurance. But endurance becomes costly when it no longer has any living relationship to the self who is enduring. That is when a woman begins to divide. One part of her keeps functioning. The other begins to drift further from language. She becomes efficient in places where she was once alive. She knows how to answer the phone, but not how to answer herself. She can organize a calendar, but not identify what she is grieving. She can sit through dinner, smile at the right places, and still feel an odd distance from her own voice as she speaks. This is not because she is cold. It is because she has been living too long in adaptation. And adaptation, when chronic, creates numbness. The body often knows this before the mind is willing to admit it. Silent self-abandonment leaves traces. It appears in the jaw that never unclenches, the shallow breath, the fatigue that sleep does not touch, the irritation that feels too large for the moment, the inability to rest without guilt, the vague dread on Sunday evenings, the sudden tears in the car that seem to come from nowhere. These are not random inconveniences. They are often the language of a life that has been overmanaged and underfelt. I think many women misread these signals because they do not fit the dramatic image of suffering. There may be no catastrophe, no public crisis, no obvious disaster to justify the depth of disconnection. That is why the pain is so often minimized. I tell myself I am only stressed. I say I need a vacation. I blame hormones, age, workload, timing. Sometimes those things are part of the story. But sometimes what I am calling stress is sorrow. Sometimes what I am calling busyness is avoidance. Sometimes what I am calling stability is emotional starvation with good lighting. There is also a more hidden layer to this. A woman can become attached to the identity that self-abandonment creates. The strong one. The generous one. The easy one. The one who never needs too much. These identities are not false exactly. They often contain real virtues. But when they become the only acceptable way for me to exist, they harden into roles, and roles can become prisons when they are no longer chosen freely. Then something painful happens. I begin defending the very pattern that is draining me, because it has become the shape of my worth. If I stop overgiving, who am I? If I stop being endlessly available, will I still be loved? If I stop smoothing over discomfort, what relationships will reveal themselves as shallow? If I stop carrying everyone so gracefully, what grief will finally catch up with me? These are not casual questions. They are existential ones. That is why so many women stay in silent self-abandonment long after it has begun to hollow them out. The pattern is painful, but it is familiar. And the self I might become without it is still unknown. There is a loneliness to this stage of life that almost no one talks about honestly. Not the loneliness of being physically alone, but the loneliness of realizing I have been living beside myself. The loneliness of hearing my own laughter and noticing that it sounds practiced. The loneliness of being praised for a version of me that no longer feels fully inhabited. The loneliness of watching the world respond to my competence while something more fragile and essential inside me goes untouched. That is why recognition is so important. Before a woman changes, she usually notices. Not all at once, but in flashes. A conversation leaves her more tired than it should. A quiet weekend reveals how uneasy she is without constant demands. A simple question lands harder than expected. What do I want now? She may not know the answer. In fact, she may feel panic instead of clarity. Because after years of organizing life around expectation, desire can feel almost foreign. But that panic is not proof that nothing is there. It is proof that something has been waiting under the surface for a very long time. Silent self-abandonment thrives wherever a woman is rewarded for staying disconnected from her own inner truth. It grows in the gap between what I feel and what I permit myself to know. It deepens every time I choose manageability over honesty, image over embodiment, usefulness over reality. And eventually, if I live there too long, I begin to mistake the absence of open conflict for the presence of peace. But peace and disconnection are not the same thing. Peace softens the body. Disconnection silences it. Peace makes a life feel inhabited. Disconnection makes it feel efficient. Peace allows me to be present. Disconnection asks me only to perform presence convincingly enough that no one questions the cost. This is the psychology of silent self-abandonment. Not a dramatic refusal of the self, but a slow relocation away from it. 1,000 small departures. A life built so carefully around other people's comfort, other people's needs, other people's expectations, that my own inner world starts to feel like a distant country I once knew how to enter. And yet, even here, something remains alive. That is the part that notices. The part that aches. The part that can no longer fully disappear inside the role. And when that part begins to stir, I start to realize I am not one woman. I am at least two. The woman who learned to survive by performing, and the woman beneath her who has been waiting for me to come back. There came a point when I could no longer pretend that all the contradictions inside me belonged to one simple identity. I had spent too many years calling everything by one name. Strength. Maturity. Independence. Grace under pressure. But the truth was more complicated than that. There were at least two women living inside my life, and they did not want the same things. One woman knew exactly how to survive. She knew how to enter a room and understand it before anyone else had fully settled into their seat. She knew how to read tone, pace, mood, hesitation. She knew when to soften, when to shine, when to become useful, when to disappear just enough to keep things smooth. She knew how to speak in a way that did not threaten, how to give in a way that looked loving, how to absorb disappointment without making it expensive for anyone else. She knew how to be attractive without seeming vain, competent without seeming cold, tired without seeming fragile. She was impressive in ways the world respects. She was the woman people trusted, relied on, admired, leaned on. And then there was the other woman. She was harder to categorize, because she was not built for performance. She did not care very much about seeming easy to manage. She was slower, deeper, less interested in being approved of at every turn. She wanted truth more than polish. She wanted a life that felt inhabited, not merely well handled. She could feel the difference between being noticed and being known. She did not want to keep smiling through what hurt just because the smile had become elegant. She wanted to speak from the center of herself, not from whatever version of herself would cause the least disturbance. For a long time, I thought the first woman was simply the grown, successful, socially functional version of me, and the second woman was too emotional, too inward, too impractical to take seriously. I thought the second woman belonged to private moods, passing sadness, maybe even weakness. I trusted the woman who could keep everything moving. I trusted the woman who could carry the day without dropping anything visible. I trusted the woman who knew how to perform stability. But I began to notice something unsettling. The more fully I lived from the performed woman, the less alive I felt. Not less successful. Not less admired. Not less capable. Less alive. That distinction matters. Because a woman can become extraordinarily skilled at being the version of herself that functions best in public, and still feel a quiet deadness spreading through the interior of her life. She can become beautiful at the level of arrangement while feeling increasingly absent at the level of being. She can be loved for traits that are real, yet still feel that the deepest part of her has not been met, sometimes not even by herself. The performed self is not fake in the simple sense. That would be too easy, and too cruel. She is usually made of real intelligence, real sensitivity, real adaptation, real grace. She was shaped for reasons. She emerged because she helped me survive families, relationships, workplaces, expectations, disappointments. She knows how to protect me from rejection, from humiliation, from being too exposed in rooms that do not know what to do with a woman's full humanity. She is not a liar. She is a strategist. But strategy becomes a lonely place to live when it starts replacing identity. That is what I had to face. The woman who could manage almost anything was not always the woman who felt most true. Sometimes she was simply the woman least likely to be criticized, least likely to be abandoned, least likely to be misunderstood in ways that cost too much. She knew how to stay acceptable. She did not always know how to stay whole. The rooted self is different. She does not ask first, how should I come across? She asks, what is true here? She does not build every response around minimizing discomfort. She can tolerate pauses. She can let a conversation breathe without rushing to rescue it. She is not eager to turn every silence into proof that something is wrong. She can disappoint without instantly collapsing into apology. She can be warm without becoming available to everyone. She can be loving without making love synonymous with self-erasure. That kind of woman looks quieter from the outside, but inwardly she is far less divided. What I find most moving about the rooted self is that she does not need to be dramatic in order to be real. She does not announce her depth. She does not market her boundaries. She does not turn every wound into a performance of healing. In many ways, she becomes simpler. Her no is clearer. Her yes is cleaner. Her presence has less static in it. When she enters a room, she does not arrive hungry to be mirrored correctly. She arrives already in relationship with herself. That is why she feels different. The performed self enters a room and immediately begins adjusting. What do they need from me here? How am I landing? Should I say more? Should I say less? Am I too much? Am I not enough? Even when she looks calm, there is often a subtle vigilance underneath. She is not resting in the moment. She is monitoring it. The rooted self enters and remains internally seated. She notices the room, of course. She is not oblivious. But she is not captured by it. She does not need every person to approve in order to remain intact. She can sense disapproval without reorganizing her whole nervous system around it. She can feel attraction without losing discernment. She can feel uncertainty without surrendering her center. I think this is one of the deepest shifts in a woman's life. Not when she stops feeling, but when feeling stops making her so easily steerable. The performed self is often terrified of silence because silence removes the script. Without the script, she has to feel the instability under the image. So she fills the quiet. She reaches for her phone. She over-explains. She narrates too quickly. She keeps the machinery running. Anything but the clean, unadorned moment in which she might have to meet herself without choreography. The rooted self can sit in the quiet and let it reveal her. Not because she enjoys every feeling that rises there. Often she does not. But she has stopped treating her inner world like an emergency she must immediately manage. She knows something the performed self has not fully learned yet. Not every uncomfortable feeling is a threat. Some are simply doors. And the door between these two women is often grief. Because to become rooted, I had to mourn the years I spent thinking performance was the same as identity. I had to grieve how much life force went into becoming digestible. How much intelligence went into being emotionally convenient. How much beauty was used as armor. How much kindness was mixed with fear. How many times I called self-suppression love, called over-functioning strength, called being chosen security. None of this made me weak. But it did make me tired. The rooted self began to emerge the moment I stopped trying to kill the performed self and started understanding her. That was important. Shame would have only created another performance, another polished brutality aimed inward. What I needed was not self-rejection, but self-recognition. I needed to see that the woman who learned to perform worth had once been protecting something tender. She was not my enemy. She was an old guardian who no longer needed to run the whole house. That is where integration begins. Not in choosing one woman and destroying the other, but in letting the deeper woman lead. The performed self may still speak. She may still flare up in certain rooms, certain relationships, certain old fears. But she is no longer the only voice in the room. The rooted self has arrived now, and she changes the atmosphere of my life simply by refusing to vanish. She is the woman who can wear beauty without hiding inside it. The woman who can love without bargaining away her center. The woman who can succeed without making success her only language. The woman who can be alone without narrating herself as unwanted. The woman who can feel longing, sadness, desire, uncertainty, even shame, and still remain fundamentally with herself. That is the woman I trust now. Not because she is flawless. Not because she is never shaken. But because she is no longer built entirely around being manageable. There are two women inside me. One learned how to survive by performing. The other knows that survival is not the same thing as belonging to myself. And every time I choose honesty over presentation, stillness over management, truth over approval, the distance between them gets smaller. That is where confidence begins to change shape. It stops being something I put on. It becomes someone I return to. What the world calls confidence, it usually notices at the surface. It notices the woman who seems calm, self-contained, elegant, clear. It notices the woman who does not overreact, who speaks with intention, who does not look hungry for approval. It notices the polished result. What it rarely sees is the private labor that made that presence possible. Real confidence is not born in performance. It is built in private rooms, during unphotographed hours, in the long invisible work of becoming honest with myself. This is the work confident women actually do. They grieve what they once had to call normal. They sit with truths that do not flatter them. They stop romanticizing what repeatedly wounds them. They let disillusionment teach them instead of turning it into bitterness. They notice where they are still acting from fear, still bargaining for love, still protecting identities that no longer fit the woman they are becoming. And perhaps hardest of all, they stop asking every pain to leave quickly. That kind of work is not dramatic enough for most people to recognize as transformation. There is no grand reveal in it. No instant becoming. No perfect breakthrough after which a woman is suddenly free of contradiction. It is quieter than that. More humbling. More adult. I think one of the first things a woman must do, if she wants the kind of confidence that is rooted rather than performed, is learn how to grieve without turning away. Not only grief in the obvious sense. Not only grief for death or divorce or unmistakable endings. I mean the subtler griefs that accumulate in a woman's life and often go unnamed because she is too busy continuing. Grief for the years spent overfunctioning. Grief for the versions of love that required self-erasure. Grief for the marriage that looked intact but felt emotionally airless. Grief for how much energy went into being agreeable, being strong, being admired, being the one who could handle it. Grief for the life I thought would feel different by now. Grief for the self I had to postpone while everyone else's needs took the front seat. A woman who never grieves these things often keeps living from them. She keeps calling exhaustion a personality trait. She keeps calling numbness maturity. She keeps calling emotional distance independence. She keeps calling old wounds standards. And in doing so, she builds her identity around what hurt her instead of what is true. Grief interrupts that. Grief softens what adaptation made rigid. Grief says, this mattered. This cost me something. This shaped me, but it will not be the only thing that defines me. I have come to think of grief as one of the most refining forces in a woman's inner life when she lets it move honestly. Not because it feels good. Often it feels like standing in a room where all the furniture has been rearranged in the dark. But grief has a way of stripping away false confidence. It removes what cannot survive truth. And what remains after that removal may be quieter, but it is far more solid. There is another kind of labor confident women do, and it has to do with solitude. Not isolation. Not withdrawing in resentment. I mean the kind of solitude that returns me to my own interior after years of reacting to everything outside me. Many women have spent so much of life responding that they no longer know what rises in them before interruption. Their minds are crowded with voices, obligations, commentary, logistics, old scripts, digital noise. No wonder intuition gets faint. No wonder the self starts to feel far away. It has had no room to speak. So the work begins with making room. That can look almost embarrassingly simple. An hour with no television on. A walk without headphones. Coffee before dawn in a quiet kitchen, not to get ahead of the day, but to hear what the day has not drowned yet. A notebook opened not for productivity, but for honesty. One difficult question written at the top of the page: what am I no longer willing to pretend does not hurt? I do not think women realize how powerful that question is until they stop long enough to let it answer. Sometimes what rises is sorrow. Sometimes anger. Sometimes nothing at first, only restlessness, which is its own revelation. Many women are so unused to unstructured inward contact that silence itself feels like threat before it feels like home. But if I stay there long enough, something underneath the noise begins to return. A memory. A longing. A truth. A recognition that I have been calling myself practical when I am actually heartbroken. Or calling myself fine when I am lonely in a way productivity cannot touch. This is why confident women often become quieter before they become freer. They are listening. They are allowing the deeper layers of themselves to surface without immediately packaging those layers into a solution. The world likes women who can fix themselves quickly, but real inner work is slower than that. It requires me to let ambiguity remain alive long enough for something genuine to form. Then there is the work of noticing patterns without defending them. This may be one of the most mature things a woman can do. To see clearly where she still returns to what depletes her. Where she still seeks validation from emotionally unavailable people. Where she still uses busyness to outrun grief. Where she still offers warmth in exchange for being chosen. Where she still confuses being wanted with being safe. Where she still tells herself a story about why this time will be different, when her body already knows the cost. Confidence deepens when I stop seducing myself with my own explanations. When I stop saying, "It is not that bad," when my nervous system has been saying otherwise for months. When I stop dressing up confusion as complexity. When I stop turning emotional crumbs into evidence of connection. When I stop calling a pattern beautiful simply because it is familiar. This does not make me cynical. It makes me less willing to participate in my own distortion. And then there is the body. A woman cannot build real confidence while remaining estranged from her body, because the body is where so much truth arrives before language. The body knows when something is off before my mind is ready to admit it. It knows what happens after certain conversations. It knows who makes me brace. It knows when desire is alive and when I am merely performing receptivity. It knows what exhaustion feels like before I turn it into an accomplishment. So part of the quiet work is learning to return to the body not as an object to correct, but as a place to live. This may mean eating more slowly, stretching at the end of the day instead of collapsing straight into numbness, walking without the pressure to optimize the walk, resting before total depletion, paying attention to what music opens me and what noise hardens me, noticing how certain clothes feel on my skin and what that says about the pace I am trying to inhabit, standing at the sink, washing a plate, and realizing I have left my own body 3 times already this morning. These moments sound small, but they are not. They are acts of re-entry. I also think confident women quietly relearn desire. Not desire as fantasy alone, and not only desire directed toward another person. Desire in the deeper sense. The return of appetite for life. The desire for beauty, for quiet, for movement, for touch, for art, for prayer, for water, for music, for a room that feels like refuge instead of storage, for friendships where truth is possible, for a morning that is not consumed before it begins. Many women have not lost desire. They have buried it under utility. The quiet work is uncovering it without shame. Maybe I want fresh flowers on the counter, not because I am performing a lovely life, but because beauty steadies me. Maybe I want to go to a museum alone and move through it slowly. Maybe I want to cook one careful meal and eat it sitting down. Maybe I want stronger legs, not for appearance, but because I want to feel myself move through the world with power again. Maybe I want less noise, less alcohol, less explanation, fewer people in my orbit, more sky, more honesty, more room. These desires matter because they restore relationship. They remind me that I am not here only to function. I am also here to feel, to choose, to inhabit. And perhaps that is the deepest invisible labor behind real confidence, the labor of becoming a woman who is no longer organized entirely around survival. A woman who has done this work may look calm from the outside, but that calm is not passivity. It is earned. It comes from private reckonings. From mourning what had to be mourned. From sitting still long enough to hear what was true. From noticing where she was still divided. From relearning her body, her limits, her desire, her honesty. From refusing to keep confusing self-abandonment with love or endurance with peace. This is why her confidence feels different. It is not made of slogans. It is not made of image. It is not made of superiority. It is made of intimacy. The intimacy of a woman who has spent enough time with herself, truthfully, to stop being a stranger there. And once that intimacy begins to form, one question becomes unavoidable. Can I live in a way that proves to myself I mean it? There is a difficult truth at the center of self-trust that many women feel before they can fully name it. My inner life does not believe my intentions. It believes my patterns. I may have beautiful realizations. I may know exactly what is hurting me. I may understand my history, my wounds, my habits, my longing, my exhaustion. I may feel a deep shift beginning in the private chambers of my heart. But if my life continues to move in the old direction, something inside me remains unconvinced. Not because I am incapable of change, but because the deeper self has learned to listen less to what I promise and more to what I repeat. That is why self-trust is built through action, not mood. Mood is unstable. Mood rises, softens, disappears, returns. Mood can be sincere and still unreliable. There are mornings when I feel clear, almost reborn in my own life, certain that I will no longer betray what I know. Then the day begins. A message arrives. Fatigue returns. An old fear gets touched. Loneliness changes its shape. The body tightens. The old reflex offers itself like a familiar chair. And suddenly the truth I felt so strongly a few hours earlier becomes negotiable again. This is where many women begin to lose faith in themselves, not because they are weak, but because they keep mistaking emotional intensity for transformation. A powerful feeling is not yet a new life. A breakthrough is not yet a pattern. A private promise is not yet self-trust. Self-trust begins when my behavior starts telling the truth my insight has already discovered. That is harder, because behavior is where self-betrayal becomes visible. It is easy to admire the idea of rest and still continue pushing until I resent everyone. It is easy to speak tenderly about boundaries and still answer the call I do not want to take. It is easy to say I am done with confusion and still return to the very places that keep me disoriented. It is easy to tell myself I matter and still treat my body, my time, my energy, my attention, as if they are endlessly negotiable. This is why the deeper self becomes skeptical. She has heard promises before. She has watched me say, "Tomorrow I will be different," and then watched me abandon myself again in ordinary ways that looked too small to count. But they do count. They count precisely because they are ordinary. Self-trust is rarely broken in grand scenes. It is worn down in the daily moments when I know what would honor me, and do something else because it is easier, more familiar, more flattering to the old self, more likely to keep external peace. The body notices this. The nervous system notices this. The soul notices this. Every repeated act teaches. If I say I need rest but keep choosing stimulation, I teach myself that my needs are decorative. If I say I deserve honesty but keep swallowing what I feel, I teach myself that truth is optional. If I say I want peace but continue feeding the habits that disturb my inner life, I teach myself that peace is a fantasy, not a standard. And if I keep doing this long enough, I begin to live with a subtle internal fracture. I say loving things to myself in theory while behaving toward myself in ways that feel unloving in practice. No wonder confidence remains thin. No wonder so many women feel moved by insight but changed so little by it. The self does not become secure because I finally understand. It becomes secure when understanding is followed by evidence. Evidence matters. Evidence is what turns inner hope into inner credibility. Not dramatic evidence. Not some cinematic act of reinvention that allows me to imagine I have become a new woman by next Tuesday. I no longer trust that kind of intensity. It is often just another performance, this time staged for myself. The kind of evidence that rebuilds inner credibility is quieter, steadier, less seductive. It does not feel glamorous. Sometimes it barely feels visible. But it changes the architecture of the inner world more than emotional drama ever could. It is the evidence of follow-through. I say I need a slower morning, and I protect the first 20 minutes of the day from noise. I say my body is tired, and I go to bed when I first feel the truth of that instead of waiting until I am hollowed out. I say a certain conversation always leaves me diminished, and I stop volunteering myself for it just because guilt still knows my name. I say I want a calmer inner life, and I stop handing my evenings over to the habits that leave me overstimulated, vaguely lonely, and far from myself. I say I want to trust my own voice, And I stop asking 5 people to approve what I already know. These acts may seem small from the outside, but inside, they are seismic. Because each one says the same thing: I heard you, and this time I did not leave. That sentence is the beginning of repair. I heard you, and this time I did not leave. I think many women underestimate how much they need this kind of repair. We speak often about discipline, motivation, healing, self-worth. But underneath all of it, there is often a quieter wound: I do not fully trust myself to stay. Not when it gets uncomfortable. Not when someone is disappointed. Not when loneliness presses against me. Not when the old pattern offers a shortcut back into familiarity. So I make promises with sincerity, and break them with fluency. Then I wonder why confidence never quite settles into my bones. Confidence cannot settle where credibility has been repeatedly broken. This is why consistency matters more than intensity. Intensity can produce hope. Consistency produces safety. And safety is what allows the inner self to unclench. A woman who becomes consistent with herself does not necessarily become stricter. In fact, often she becomes kinder. Because she no longer needs the drama of self-punishment to manufacture the illusion of change. She becomes more honest about what she can actually sustain. She chooses smaller promises and keeps them. She stops reaching for transformation through force and begins building trust through rhythm. This is one of the reasons I believe gentle consistency is more powerful than self-criticism. Self-criticism may create urgency, but it rarely creates loyalty. It may make me perform improvement for a few days, but it does not make me feel safe enough to return when I fail. And without return, there is no trust. There is only another cycle of inflation and collapse. So the real question becomes not, how do I become a better woman all at once, but what repeated action would make me feel more believable to myself? That question changes everything. Maybe the action is simple. Drink water before coffee because I matter before productivity begins. Sit in silence for 5 minutes before the world enters my nervous system. Eat lunch away from the screen. Take the evening walk even when no grand mood for healing arrives. Turn the phone face down for 1 hour and survive the discomfort of not being immediately reachable. Leave the text unanswered until I can respond from steadiness, not anxiety. Write 1 true sentence in a notebook before bed. Go to sleep when I am tired instead of staying awake to avoid myself. These are not productivity habits. They are relational acts. They teach the deeper self that I am no longer treating my own life as an afterthought. I also think there is something important in learning to notice where I still create large promises because I am secretly trying to outrun shame. Shame loves grand declarations. Grand declarations create the temporary relief of feeling redeemed before anything has actually changed. But self-trust does not need redemption theater. It needs proof of care. Real care is often modest. It says, I will not ask more of myself tonight than honesty can carry. It says, I will make 1 clean choice instead of 10 dramatic ones. It says, I will not confuse punishment with commitment. It says, I will return tomorrow without making today's imperfection into a verdict. This is how inner credibility is rebuilt. Not through perfection, but through repeated return. Repeated return after fatigue. Repeated return after old habits. Repeated return after the moment I almost left myself again. That is what makes self-trust sacred. It is not based on never failing. It is based on no longer using failure as permission to disappear. And over time, something beautiful begins to happen. The woman inside me who used to brace when I made a promise starts to listen differently. She no longer hears only longing. She starts to hear reliability. She starts to feel that I mean what I say in the language that matters most, the language of action. That is when confidence begins to change texture. It becomes less inflated, less performative, less dependent on how I feel that day. It becomes quieter, cleaner, more stable. Not because I finally mastered myself, but because I have begun to live in a way that tells the truth consistently enough for my own inner life to believe me. And once that trust starts to rebuild, another responsibility appears with it. If I am truly creating something precious inside myself, I can no longer leave it unprotected. Once I begin to rebuild trust with myself, something becomes impossible to ignore. What is fragile in the beginning cannot survive careless exposure. A woman may spend years learning how to hear herself again, how to believe what she feels, how to stop overriding the body, how to tell the truth in smaller and cleaner ways. But if she keeps giving everything and everyone unrestricted access to her mind, her time, her energy, her nervous system, that new inner life will keep getting trampled before it has time to grow roots. This is why confident women protect their inner life. Not because they are cold. Not because they are withholding. Not because they think they are above other people. They protect it because they have learned, often painfully, that anything sacred inside a woman will be eroded if she treats herself like an open hallway where every noise, every demand, every mood, every opinion, every unfinished person can pass through. There is a version of kindness many women are taught that is actually self-erasure in softer clothing. It says I should always be reachable, always understanding, always available, always flexible, always gracious, always willing to absorb the discomfort so no one else has to. It praises me for being easy to approach, easy to use, easy to lean on, easy to interrupt. And for a long time, that version of kindness can feel morally beautiful. It can even become part of my identity. I become the woman who makes things easier for everyone. But eventually I have to ask a harder question. What has this made harder for me? That question changes everything. Because confidence is not only built by what I say yes to. It is built by what I refuse to let keep entering me. The calls I no longer answer simply because the phone rings. The conversations I no longer keep alive out of politeness when my body is already asking to leave. The emotional messes I no longer adopt just because I am capable of carrying them. The habits I no longer excuse because they are familiar. The spaces, digital and physical, that leave me fractured long after I exit them. Protection begins there. Not with grand declarations, but with a subtle shift in self-respect. I stop assuming that access to me is automatically deserved. That sentence alone can feel radical for women who have spent decades proving love through availability. But the truth is, constant access is not intimacy. In many cases, it is the opposite. It is overexposure without discernment. It is the draining belief that I must always stay open in order to remain lovable. A confident woman learns that being open-hearted and being unguarded are not the same thing. She can be warm without becoming porous. She can be generous without becoming depleted. She can care deeply without making herself endlessly accessible to whatever is loudest, neediest, or most demanding. This becomes especially important after a woman has spent years living in reaction. Years of answering too quickly, giving too much, explaining too often, overriding herself to maintain harmony. When she finally begins returning to herself, the first thing she often notices is how overstimulated she has been. How much of her daily life has been built around interruption. Other people's urgency. Other people's expectations. Other people's moods arriving in her pocket, on her screen, at her table, inside her sleep. No wonder she could not hear herself. She was never alone with her own mind long enough for it to become a home. So boundaries begin not only with people, but with atmosphere. I think many women underestimate how much their inner life is shaped by what enters the first hour of the day. If I wake and immediately let news, messages, work demands, social media, and emotional static flood my body before I have had a single clean moment with myself, I have already handed the day away. I have already made myself secondary. And if I repeat that long enough, it becomes difficult to remember what my own mind sounds like before the world starts speaking through it. Protection, then, can look almost ordinary. A morning with no phone for the first 30 minutes. Coffee in silence instead of commentary. A window open. The bed made not as performance, but as a small act of order. A kitchen that feels inhabited, not merely used. A room with one beautiful corner that tells my nervous system I live here too. Fresh flowers on the counter. A lamp lit in the evening. Music that softens me instead of noise that keeps me braced. A walk after dinner when I can feel the day leaving my body. A chair where I sit to read instead of collapsing into distraction. These are not decorative details. They are signals. They tell me whether my life is arranged only for function, or whether it makes room for peace. Peace is not accidental. It is protected. And so is clarity. Clarity does not grow well in chaos. It does not survive endless exposure to people who leave me doubting what I know, to habits that scatter my attention, to environments that teach my body to stay on alert. A woman who wants a clearer inner life has to become more honest about what clouds it. Some people cloud it. Not because they are evil, but because every interaction with them leaves me less rooted in myself. I feel scrambled after talking to them. Guilty. Drained. Agitated. Uncertain in ways that do not feel illuminating, only diminishing. For years I may ignore this because nothing explicitly terrible has happened. They are not cruel enough to justify a dramatic exit. They are simply costly. And women often stay too long in what is merely costly because we have been taught to reserve self-protection for emergencies. But confidence matures when I stop waiting for disaster to honor discomfort. I no longer need a courtroom case to justify distance. Sometimes it is enough that I leave a conversation and feel further from myself than I was before it began. That matters. That counts. That is information. The same is true of digital life. There are forms of contact that quietly corrode emotional self-respect. Endless scrolling that leaves me comparing. Late-night checking that turns loneliness into restlessness. Revisiting old messages to feel chosen by memory. Staying connected to lives, people, and narratives that keep my nervous system hooked into longing, inadequacy, or emotional rehearsal. These patterns can look harmless because they are so common. But common does not mean benign. A confident woman becomes more discerning about what she repeatedly consumes because she understands that attention is not neutral. Whatever I feed with attention begins to shape the emotional climate of my life. So I ask different questions now. What leaves me more like myself? What leaves me less? What deepens my peace? What quietly humiliates it? What relationships feel mutual? What relationships run on my overfunctioning? What habits restore dignity to my inner life? What habits make me easier to abandon? These questions are not harsh. They are respectful. They assume that my interior deserves stewardship. That word matters to me. Stewardship. It feels gentler and truer than control. I am not trying to dominate myself into better behavior. I am learning how to care for what is becoming precious again. My time. My attention. My body. My mornings. My evenings. My tenderness. My limits. My capacity for joy. My ability to hear the deeper voice beneath all the old noise. And yes, this often means disappointing people. There is no honest way around that. When a woman stops being endlessly available, someone will call her distant. When she stops over-explaining, someone will call her changed. When she responds more slowly, leaves earlier, declines more cleanly, and no longer volunteers herself for every emotional task in the room, someone may feel the loss of her former accessibility. That does not mean she is doing something wrong. It often means the old arrangement is ending. Confidence includes the ability to survive being misread while staying faithful to what is true. That is a very adult form of self-respect. Not the theatrical kind. Not the kind that announces itself with perfect language. The quieter kind. The kind that says I do not owe everyone full access to the woman I am still learning to protect. The kind that understands that my no does not need to be angry to be real. The kind that knows not every invitation deserves my energy, not every message deserves my immediacy, not every relationship deserves continued intimacy simply because it has history. History alone is not a reason to stay exposed. Neither is guilt. Neither is loneliness. Neither is the old hunger to be chosen. This is what makes boundaries so sacred for women in the middle of life. They are not just interpersonal tools. They are declarations of inner order. They say my peace is not an afterthought. My limits are not rude. My need for stillness is not weakness. My desire to protect what is becoming clear inside me is not selfishness. It is wisdom. And something beautiful happens when a woman begins to live this way. Her energy changes. Not because she becomes harder, but because she becomes less scattered. Her speech becomes cleaner because she is no longer speaking from inner overextension. Her body softens in certain places because it no longer has to absorb everything. Her yes becomes more meaningful because it is no longer automatic. Her no becomes more trustworthy because it is no longer postponed until resentment. Her relationships become more honest because she is no longer using overgiving to hold them together. She begins to feel inhabitable to herself. That may be one of the deepest forms of confidence a woman can know. Not being admired by everyone. Not being understood by everyone. Not winning every room. But becoming a place inside her own life where she can finally rest. And once a woman begins to protect her inner life this way, the world does not just see a woman with boundaries. It sees a woman whose presence has changed because she no longer leaves herself open to everything that once kept her divided. When I stop abandoning myself, the first thing that changes is not my life on the outside. It is the atmosphere inside it. The rooms are the same. The city is the same. The mornings still come with their ordinary demands. The kitchen still waits. The phone still lights up. The world does not suddenly become gentle because I have changed. There are still disappointments, unfinished conversations, lonely evenings, practical burdens, ordinary fatigue. But something inside the experience is no longer arranged the same way. I am no longer living with the constant, invisible fracture of being present everywhere except within myself. That fracture is what had exhausted me more than I understood. It was not only the work, the responsibilities, the relationships, the years of holding everything together. It was the fact that I had been doing all of it while quietly leaving my own side. I had learned to function with that split so well that it began to feel normal. But once the split begins to heal, once I stop treating myself as the part of life that can always be postponed, there is a form of relief so deep it almost feels like grief at first. Because I begin to see how long I lived without myself. That realization is tender. It is not theatrical. It does not need a dramatic soundtrack. It can come while standing barefoot on the kitchen floor before sunrise, hand wrapped around a mug, looking out at a street that has not yet fully woken up. It can come while folding laundry, or driving home in the dark, or sitting alone in the parked car for a few extra minutes because for the first time in a long time, the silence does not feel like emptiness. It feels like company. My own company. That is the transformation people rarely talk about when they talk about confidence. They talk about presence, poise, self-worth, boundaries, radiance. But beneath all of that is something simpler and far more profound. A woman who stops abandoning herself is no longer alone in the most painful way. She may still experience solitude. She may still long for love, for closeness, for understanding, for the right kind of witness. But the desperate loneliness begins to soften because she is no longer participating in her own disappearance. This changes everything, though not always in loud ways. I begin to speak differently. Less decoration. Less preemptive explaining. Less instinct to make myself easier to receive. My words become cleaner because they are no longer trying to rescue me from misunderstanding before it even arrives. There is less static in my voice. I do not need every sentence to do emotional labor on my behalf. I begin to listen differently too. Not only to other people, but to what happens inside me while they speak. I notice when my body opens. I notice when it contracts. I notice when I am about to agree to something that does not feel true. I notice when a conversation asks me to leave myself in order to keep it comfortable. And because I have spent time rebuilding trust, these moments no longer pass by like background noise. They matter now. I matter now. This is what embodied confidence feels like. Not an idea about myself. Not a performance of certainty. A lived relationship between my inner truth and the way I move through the world. That relationship creates a different pace. I do not rush the same way. I do not chase closure from people who cannot offer it. I do not turn every delay into rejection. I do not build elaborate emotional stories from small fragments of attention. I recover more quickly from disappointment because I am no longer using every disappointment to reopen the oldest wound in me. This does not mean I stop feeling deeply. In some ways, I feel more deeply than before. But depth is different from drowning. Before, a single moment could take me far from myself because I was already internally unanchored. Now, pain still touches me, but it does not define the whole weather of my being so easily. I can feel hurt and remain with myself. I can feel uncertainty and still move with dignity. I can feel longing without turning it into self-erasure. That is a different woman. Not a perfect woman. Not a woman above grief or desire or fear. A woman whose center of gravity has changed. There is also a visible shift in what I am available for. When I stop abandoning myself, counterfeit connection loses some of its power. I become less seduced by what is inconsistent, flashy, ambiguous in the wrong ways, emotionally expensive, or only intermittently tender. I do not need every open door to be a sign. I do not need every spark to become a story. I begin to understand the difference between what stimulates me and what nourishes me. That distinction alone saves years of unnecessary pain. I also stop making every ending about my worth. This may be one of the greatest mercies of embodied confidence. Not that endings stop hurting, but that they stop automatically becoming evidence against me. A person can fail to meet me without it meaning I was too much or not enough. A relationship can end without reducing my whole history to a lesson in unworthiness. A season can close without demanding that I reinvent myself in panic. I can grieve what left without collapsing into the belief that I was left because I lacked value. This gives me back enormous energy. The energy I once spent interpreting every silence, managing every perception, bargaining with every disappointment, can now return to more honest places. Beauty, rest, friendship, art, prayer, movement, pleasure, work that feels clean instead of punishing. Even ordinary rituals begin to glow differently when I am no longer estranged from myself. The evening lamp, the shower after a long day, music in the kitchen, fresh sheets, a walk under a cold sky, a novel in bed, the smell of olive oil and rosemary in a quiet house. These things are not substitutes for a meaningful life. They are part of one. And when I am present inside my own experience, they begin to feel sufficient in a way they never could when I was living in a constant state of inner departure. This is why embodied confidence often looks quieter than people expect. It is not trying to impress. It is not trying to dominate a room. It is not trying to prove evolution. It has nothing to advertise. It is simply the visible effect of a woman whose inner and outer lives are no longer at war. People feel this before they can name it. They feel it in the way I do not overreach. They feel it in the way I can pause. They feel it in the way I no longer rush to fill silence with self-defense. They feel it in the way my attention is less frantic, my warmth less overextended, my boundaries less apologetic. They feel it in the way I am no longer pleading, even invisibly, to be chosen in order to feel real. That is what makes a woman quietly magnetic. Not mystery for its own sake. Not distance. Not indifference. Wholeness. A whole woman affects a room differently than a divided one. A divided woman may be charming, impressive, desirable, admired. But somewhere beneath it, people often sense the strain. The subtle self-negotiation. The effort of holding everything together. A whole woman may say less. She may not draw attention in obvious ways. But people sense rest in her. They sense that she is not using the room to complete herself. And that allows everyone around her to exhale a little more honestly. Perhaps that is the most beautiful part of this transformation. When I stop abandoning myself, I become safer not only for me, but for others too. Safer because I am no longer asking them, in hidden ways, to rescue me from my own disconnection. Safer because my kindness is less entangled with fear. Safer because my love becomes less bargaining and more choice. And still, this transformation is not without sorrow. There are moments when I look back and feel grief for the years I lived divided. For the younger woman who thought performance would save her. For the woman who kept giving from depletion because she thought being needed was the same as being cherished. For the years I confused numbness with stability and over-functioning with strength. That grief is real. But now it comes with tenderness instead of contempt. I do not need to hate the woman I was in order to honor the woman I am becoming. In fact, I think the deepest confidence always includes compassion for the selves who survived before the truth was fully possible. So what happens when I stop abandoning myself? I become less available for confusion and more available for peace. I become less enchanted by performance and more loyal to what is real. I become less interested in being seen correctly by everyone and more interested in remaining true in my own eyes. I become simpler, cleaner, quieter. Not smaller. Not harder. More whole. And maybe that is what the second half of life is really offering a woman, if she is brave enough to receive it. Not reinvention as spectacle. Not one more exhausting attempt to become someone shinier. Something far more radical than that. Return. Return to the body. Return to discernment. Return to beauty. Return to inner order. Return to the woman who was waiting underneath all the roles, all the performances, all the years of endurance. The secret confident women know is not that they are more certain than everyone else. It is that they have learned to stay. To stay with themselves in grief. To stay with themselves in desire. To stay with themselves in uncertainty. To stay with themselves when old patterns call them back. To stay long enough that presence becomes their nature instead of their effort. And that kind of confidence cannot be borrowed. It cannot be styled into existence. It cannot be faked for very long. It can only be lived. That is why it feels so rare. And that is why, once a woman has touched it, even briefly, she can never again be fully satisfied with a life that asks her to disappear in order to belong. Because she knows now what it means to finally be accompanied by herself. And once that happens, everything begins to change. What this story reveals, more than anything, is that a woman does not lose herself all at once. She loses herself gradually, elegantly, almost invisibly, in the small places where survival becomes more practice than truth. She learns how to be capable, dependable, composed, and easy to rely on. She learns how to carry responsibility without making a scene, how to keep going when no one notices the cost, how to stay functional even while something essential inside her begins to go quiet. From the outside, her life may still look admirable. But inwardly, she starts to feel the distance between who she appears to be and who she actually is. That distance becomes the hidden pain of her life. The turning point in her story does not come when she becomes louder, harder, or more perfect. It comes when she begins to tell the truth to herself. She sees that what she once called strength was sometimes self-abandonment. What she once called maturity was sometimes emotional silence. What she once called love was sometimes overgiving born from fear. And once she sees that, she cannot fully return to the old unconscious life. She begins to believe herself. She begins to notice her body, her fatigue, her grief, her longing, her boundaries, her need for stillness, and the old patterns that once kept her acceptable but internally divided. Slowly, she stops performing her way through life and starts returning to herself. That is the real transformation. Not becoming flawless, but becoming whole. Not becoming fearless, but becoming loyal to herself. Not building a more convincing image, but creating an inner life she can finally live inside. She learns that confidence is not a mood, not a pose, and not a personality style. It is the result of self-trust. It is what grows when she keeps small promises to herself, protects her peace, honors what feels true, and stops giving full access to everything that weakens her center. Over time, her presence changes. She speaks more simply. She explains less. She chooses more carefully. She becomes less available for confusion and more available for peace. She no longer needs to abandon herself to be loved, and that is what makes her quietly magnetic. The deeper lesson is this: many women are not failing at life. They are simply exhausted from living too far away from themselves. The answer is not more performance, more pressure, or more polished strength. The answer is return. Return to the body. Return to truth. Return to discernment. Return to the quiet voice inside that has been waiting patiently beneath all the noise. In daily life, this can look very simple. Pause before saying yes. Notice what leaves you drained. Protect the first moments of your morning. Stop calling exhaustion a personality trait. Tell yourself one honest sentence each day. Let your no be clean. Let your rest count. Let your peace matter. These are not small things. They are how a woman rebuilds her life from the inside out. You're not broken. You're just in the middle. Here is a small question for you. Which is harder for you right now? A. Trusting my own feelings. B. Setting boundaries to protect my peace. Comment A or B below. And if this story touched something real in you, share your thoughts in the comments too. What part of this journey felt closest to your own life? Your perspective may help another woman feel less alone. Subscribe to the channel to support this space and help keep these deeper, honest conversations going.